It is a great pleasure to be here, and in fact, it's good for me. Today, a very tough day in the environmental history of the planet, one of the toughest, when the most important nation on Earth decided that it was going to cease any effort to deal with the greatest crisis that we have ever faced. And so it is good to be in the company of others and to be about the work of fomenting some resistance to that. That sounds very grim and dark. Basically, y'all are here to watch a movie, and I'm aware that I'm kind of in the way of that. I kind of feel like I do sometimes when I'm giving a commencement address at some college, and it's clear to me that I'm the last thing between the students and their diploma, and all they have to do is just endure a few more minutes. Well, you just have to endure a few minutes here, and then on to this tasty 35 millimeter print of Steinbeck's great film. I do want to say a few words about it. Grapes of Wrath is, of course, among the great American novels. One of the problems with Steinbeck is that there are very few sex scenes in his books, and hence they all get read in junior high and high school. And so people think of them as books for junior high or high schoolers, but in fact they are among the greatest works of art that Americans have ever produced, and Grapes of Wrath first and foremost among them. And it was a book not only of its moment, but a book for all time. Although I think Steinbeck didn't understand or couldn't have understood when he was writing it in a certain way how apropos it would be for this century. As Catherine said, I wrote the first book about climate change for a general audience back in 1989. And at the time, it was a fairly theoretical idea that we were about to change the world. We knew it was coming. There was no doubt that burning coal and gas and oil produced CO2, and that the molecular structure of CO2's trapped heat that would otherwise radiate back out to space. But since it hadn't yet fully happened, it was still an abstract idea. The story of the last quarter century is that abstract idea turned real much more quickly and with much more bite than scientists had originally predicted, scientists being by their nature conservative. And so we now live in the early but palpable days of the greatest change on our planet in the course of human civilization. The temperature of the Earth set a new record in 2014. That record was smashed in 2015, and that record was obliterated in 2016. By far the warmest year we've ever had on the planet. As of yesterday, the records for total sea ice in the Arctic and the Antarctic are at absolute all-time lows for this date. Things are already quite remarkably out of balance. Last summer saw the highest temperatures ever reliably recorded on this planet, 129 degrees Fahrenheit in cities like Basra in Iraq. That's higher than humans can tolerate, at least outdoors, for any long periods of time. And yet those are the temperatures that the computer models make clear will be relatively common over fairly large parts of the Earth before very much longer, if we keep at anything like the track that we're on now. So far, humans have raised the average temperature of the Earth about 1 degree Celsius, 1.7 degrees or so Fahrenheit. But we're on track to raise the temperature of the Earth 3.5 or 4 degrees Celsius in the course of this century, which would take the planet to a warmer temperature than we're already closing in on a warmer temperature than any time in the history of primate evolution. we're into completely uncharted territory. And if we allow that kind of thing to happen, then there is no reason to think that we can have civilizations anything like the ones that we're used to. And one of the biggest reasons for that is the simple physical fact, and if you want one fact to kind of understand the 21st century, this might be it. Warm air holds more water vapor than cold air, okay? That means that in arid areas, you get more evaporation and hence more drought. Once water is evaporated into the atmosphere, the average residence time for a molecule of water vapor in the atmosphere is about 7 days, and that means that that water then comes down, and comes down in downpours, in storms like we haven't seen before. In our corner of the world, we're probably more likely to see those downpours. In fact, severe storms that drop more than 2 inches of rain in a 24-hour period, have increased about 71% across the Northeast United States over the last 40 years. That's why the easiest audience on earth to convince about climate change are people who run the DPW departments in towns across the eastern US. They've spent the last 20 years ripping out 8-inch culverts and putting in 10-inch culverts every place they are, because the old rules of thumb, the old book, no longer works. We live in a different world. That's a difficult problem to cope with. I mean, in Vermont, 5 years ago now, we had Hurricane Irene that dropped more rain than we'd ever seen on our state, and wiped out covered bridges that had been there for 150 years, did more damage. But that's probably, at least for the moment, at least in the short run, damage that rich places like the Northeast United States can at least begin to cope with. Drought in agricultural parts of the world is a force that no one can cope with, and that's what we're seeing more and more and more and more. Some of you may have read the story on the front page of the Times yesterday about the drought now underway in Somalia, South Sudan, Yemen, other parts of that sort of upper part of Africa. The Times described it as the greatest humanitarian crisis since the end of World War II, with 20 million people at the risk of starvation as famine creeps across that area, many of them already dying. In parts of that region, 100 people a day dying now as famine takes root. Livestock being killed off en masse because there's nothing to feed people. People on the move out of pastoral areas into cities with all the tensions that come with that. The Times story was actually very good. It said quite explicitly that people were paying the price in those parts of the world for the attachment in the rich parts of the world to appliances and lifestyles and things that they would have no chance ever of enjoying. That's true. That's how this works. And it's one of the reasons why Grapes of Wrath is so important. It's not just that it demonstrates what happens when you have a drought, though it definitely demonstrates that. The droughts of the 1930s that caused the Dust Bowl came with what had been the hottest summers that we've measured in America until the last few years. But it's not just that those droughts make it difficult to grow food, which they obviously do. It's also that, as in the case of the Okies in the middle of America in the 1930s, things like drought push much the hardest at those who are least able to deal with them. The real truth about climate change is that there's almost a perfect inverse correlation between how much of the problem you caused and how quickly and painfully you deal with the consequences, okay? And I mean, that's changing, and it will change as it spreads out around the world in its effects. But for the moment, those of us in the rich world are still able, at least a little bit, to deal with the consequences. So California has just gone through an incredibly deep 5-year drought, the deepest drought, we think, looking at the record in the course of human civilization. It caused great damage to the agricultural sector of California, but California is one of the richest places on earth, and so it weathered it in some form or another. Look at Syria and that part of the Middle East. In the period from 2005 to 2012 or so, it underwent the deepest drought in its human history. This is the area that we used to call the Fertile Crescent, okay? One of the places that was a birthplace of agriculture on this planet. But the drought was so deep and so bad that at least 1 million farmers in Syria alone were forced off their land and into the cities. And this is one of, if not the most important factor in sparking what became this out-of-control civil war. The great deal of academic work done on this subject in the last 2 or 3 years to demonstrate the destabilizing effect that migration, internal migration, had on Syria, and then on the world as a whole, as those refugees spread out across Europe, helping to spark the refugee crisis there, the turn to a kind of populist right that in turn was echoed across the Atlantic here. In our own country, we live in a highly connected world. So the question, I guess, is what to do about any of this. I'm going to show you just a few pictures. I could show you many, because one of the things we've done at 350.org over the years is take a lot of pictures. Try and help people understand how they're knit together around the world. A couple of years ago, we did this series of demonstrations. It turned out about 3,000 places around the planet where people had already felt the sting of climate change. We called it Connect the Dots. And one of the things we were trying to get across was how much damage there already was. But we were surprised at how many places and how many people joined in, and how many of them were suffering from these deep changes in hydrological cycles, either too much or too little water as we raise the temperature of the planet. Many places, like this in Kenya, drought had become endemic. This city in the years since has become the kind of center of the Boko Haram Islamic terrorism uprising in that part of the world, in large measure because people's lives have been so destabilized as it's become impossible to pursue traditional ways of life. Other places the damage is, less critical, except that it is kind of sad to be losing winter as an idea. These are people in Siberia. We now have big forest fires, 3, 4, 5 degrees of latitude north of where we've ever seen them before because it's gotten so dry and so hot. These are people, obviously, who are having to leave their homes in places like Micronesia as sea levels rise. That top red balloon is where the Dead Sea was 40 years ago. There were a lot of pictures like this that day from India, because we have a lot of people in India. This one just stuck in my mind because it just came with a little note that said, there is no longer any water behind our dam. And the same in the Congo. These people were on the opposite end of the spectrum. They're in the part of Pakistan that in 2010 had the worst flooding since Noah. I mean, the rain up at the Khyber Pass for days and days broke every possible record. The Indus River eventually swelled to the point where it covered about a quarter of the country. 20 million people were forced from their homes. And as you can tell by looking at them, most of them had very little to do with causing the problem in which they found themselves enmeshed. But the same sort of thing all over the planet, place after place after place. Too much water or too little water, again and again and again. That picture stuck very much in my mind, not because it was a very big demonstration, it wasn't, but because of what those signs said. Your actions affect me, which is completely true. Look, this town where this was taken 5 years ago, last year was literally wiped off the map. That big hurricane that came up through the southwest part of Haiti and then just brushed happily the Florida coast and headed through North Carolina, but it obliterated the city of Lake 80% of the housing and buildings wrecked. Because record warm sea surface temperatures had allowed the formation of a storm the size of which we hadn't seen before. Your actions affect me, but not vice versa. There's really nothing that people in Haiti can do to affect the outcome of this story, aside from appealing to our better natures. You know, they cannot get to the centers of power like the White House to demand action. They can't use less fossil fuel because they're not using any fossil fuel at the moment. So things like the really important climate week that's going on in Brookline right about now, I mean, those would be a joke in Haiti because the thought of telling people to figure out how to use less fossil fuel would be as, mystical as telling them to, levitate themselves. They're not using any now. They can't divest their endowments and portfolios from fossil fuel because they don't have any endowments and portfolios to divest. There are no pots of money sitting around in their institutions. All they can do is ask us to do the work that we should do. And happily, people are beginning to do it. The resistance is rising around this country and around this world, and we need it to rise much faster, especially now in the days of Trump. We've had some success over the last few years. Yesterday or the day before, Donald Trump signed the federal permit for the Keystone Pipeline, which was particularly sad day for me because I'd worked very hard on this particular fight, a fight that's by no means over. This thing is not built yet, and I don't think it will be if we're able to continue fighting. But the important thing about that Keystone fight was that it was the first, not the last. It was the first time that people had managed to successfully challenge, at least for a while, big plans by the fossil fuel industry. And when people saw that it was possible to do that, all over the world, people started working. Now, every frac well, every pipeline, the Spectra pipeline here in Boston, every coal mine, every new LNG port, everything gets challenged and challenged effectively, and some of the time we win. These are people that we called kayaktivists. And they're in the water in Portland and Seattle, blocking the big Shell drilling rigs that wanted to go up to the Arctic 2 summers ago to open up the Arctic for oil drilling. They caused enough trouble that Shell backed down. Just yesterday, the state of Maryland banned fracking permanently within the state. It's high time for Massachusetts to do things like divest its pension funds from fossil fuel. I'll close by saying that if you watch The Grapes of Wrath and it leaves you in the mood to do some work, some organizing, some coming together, well, think about that period a little bit, about the 1930s. Think about the reaction to it. Think about the New Deal and FDR. Think about the work that went on across the Great Plains with the Soil Conservation Service and a whole, planted tens of millions of trees. We figured out new ways to till soil. Not perfect, but a big improvement over what was going on. Think about the social welfare mechanisms that grew up in the 1930s in response to things things like the migration of Okies west to California. And then think about coming together to do this kind of work again. The resistance that's begun in the Trump year is a good sign. I bet that a lot of people here were at one of the women's marches or another on the 22nd of January. They were inspiring as can be, and so was everybody who went to the airports around immigration. And I know that there were people out at Logan, and that was powerful. There's going to be a big climate march on April 29th in D.C. There are people outside signing people up for buses to come to Washington. It's a, fairly long, somewhat uncomfortable bus trip to sit to Washington, but it's not that bad. When you get there, it'll be fun. And a little bit of, a little bit of putting yourself out is more or less what's demanded at the moment of all of us. I won't bother telling you tonight that you need to go to jail or something, because you may in the time ahead. Some people have already preceded you there. But at least for the moment, we need people marching in the streets, demonstrating that this will not go down easily. When we do it, it works. We saw what happened to the efforts to get rid of health care last week. That's because people came out. We did this in New York City in 2014, and it was beautiful. 400,000 people marching down 6th Avenue to Times Square. It was really, really something. I think, in fact, since we're in a movie theater here, I can maybe show you just a little clip of it. Let's see if this works. It's so much fun to have a real screen and projectors and things.
One march will take place 2 days before President Obama and world leaders attend the climate summit at the UN.
Climate change will bring more extreme weather, and action is now more urgent than ever.
Millions of people around the world gathered in the largest climate action march in history.
The biggest gathering seeking to address climate change ever.
2,000 rallies in 162 countries, from Paris, Melbourne, Australia, Rio de Janeiro.
Activists are filling the streets to demand action on climate change.
We are here because we are redefining this moment, this movement, this time. I want to thank all of the marchers today for coming together and taking a stand. We need you.
We all saw a massive people's march. I hope the leaders of the world listened.
We're the first generation to feel the impacts of climate change and the last to lead without.
Our citizens keep marching. We cannot pretend we do not hear them. We have to answer the call.
I'll just end by saying that it was, Steinbeck was very clearly one of those writers who wrote hoping to cause political action among the people who read what he had to write. That was part of his work as an artist. And it was absolutely necessary in the 1930s in this country, a period when things could have gone in any number of directions. And thank heaven they went in more or less the right one, because people figured out how to come together. We're in another one of those periods. And this is the issue of all issues in this time and place. I'll see you in Washington, April 29th. Thank you.